Hi class, Dr. Jim here. In this lecture, we're going to look at how the animals regulate a lot of their internal environment. And so today we're going to be focusing primarily on how the endocrine system works. We're also going to talk about the tissues of animals and that, and again, how they're organized, but primarily focusing on homeostasis and how they maintain their internal environment. Now, animals are really interesting, again, from the wide range. When we look at mammals, mammals have been so successful because they've been able to develop endothermy along with birds. And so that's one of the things that have really made mammals very successful. We don't have to sit out in the sun and warm ourselves up. We allow our body temperature to be regulated by hormones, by our blood pressure, by a number of different things, and that can regulate and allow us to survive in a lot of different environments. And we don't have to either sit in the dark to cool ourselves off or sit on a hot rock to heat us up. And so that's one of the nice things about that. So that's one of the things we're going to look at today. We're going to look at how we regulate that homeostasis. We're going to talk about the endocrine system, like I said, and then we're also going to look at tissues as well. And so we're going to see how animals organize their tissues and talk about the main tissues found in animals, especially the vertebrate animals today. Okay, and so this will be the first part. The second part of this lecture I have set up is the looking at the kidneys. And again, that's an important regulation mechanism. And so I don't have it in this lecture. I kind of broke it up so it wouldn't be as long and that stuff. So, but that's the second lecture. It's a much shorter lecture. It's only about 30 minutes. And again, looking just specifically at kidney function and how we osmoregulate the water and water loss in our bodies. And again, being on land, very important for that. So let's take a look today at, like I said, tissues and then the endocrine system and see how this is done in animals. And so again, here's a nice picture just showing you a lot of different parts of the endocrine systems in humans. We're going to talk a little bit about some of these organs, but specifically we're just going to talk about the role and the function of some of these guys and what they do and how they do the job that they're supposed to do in the body. Okay? So the first thing we're going to look at is animal tissues. And so look at animal tissues and the organs that correlate with their function. And so we'll go quickly through that. We're going to spend a lot more time looking at organ systems and that stuff as we go along. So the next big chapter is just 33 is going to look at digestive system. Then we're going to look at the nervous system. We're going to look at the cardiovascular system, respiration, and all that. So I'm going to go through it really quick because, again, we're going to spend a lot of time the rest of the semester on it. So I won't spend too much time looking at the organ systems. But today I will talk a little bit about the tissues and show you some pictures of the tissues and that stuff. And we may actually look at these things in the lab because I think it's an important concept. And this book kind of brushes over it really quick. And so I think we should take our time and look at tissues as well. The second part of this lecture, we're going to look at the endocrine system and how it functions. And again, how does it regulate animal physiology? So we're going to look at how do we maintain our internal environment using the endocrine system. And then finally, the last part, kind of look at homeostasis and how we use feedback loops to regulate and maintain the internal environment. Like I said, with the mammals, you find that we have a much better control over internal environment in terms of heat and some of the other regulation than other animals because we're endotherms, because we can control our internal environment. Other animals are ectotherms, meaning that they have to rely on the temperature outside to regulate their temperature. And so again, we'll look at the difference between the two and how that all works. And so we're going to spend some time looking at that as well and how we can regulate our bodies and doing those things. Not only temperature, but other focus as well in looking at those things. And so again, when we look at the animal structure, we talk about anatomy, and you guys have seen or heard about anatomy. And again, we don't get too carried away with anatomy in here, but again, we're going to learn about all the tissues and all the organs and all that good stuff. And so, but we have this wonderful 2 classes called anatomy physiology, where you really spend the time learning the processes there. And so anatomy is the study of the biological form of an organism. Again, the A&P classes that we have primarily look at humans and a little bit about the mammals and then humans in general. And then the physiology is the study of the biological functions. And so again, the anatomy is the structure, the physiology is the functions of these organs. And again, the form and function are closely related. And again, if we look at this ant, again, even in the invertebrates, you can see that their animal body and their body plan has been adapted to what they do best. And so again, ants can lift a huge amount of weight. And again, even though they have these very tiny legs, they're able to support themselves and be able to do a lot of the things based on their body plan and their structure. And so again, we're going to look at some of that today and how that all correlates. Now, multicellularity allows for cellular specialization, and again, the specialized cells allow for, again, the different aspects that these bodies can do. And so what you see in these multicellular animals is that they only, instead of having to do multiple functions, they really get specialized and do one. And so that's the biggest thing that you see in any of these multicellular animals, is they're going to have specialized cells and tissues that do just one thing. And then they can respond from other systems, but primarily their role is to do one thing and one thing in life, and that's that. So if we think of a lung cell is there to do gas exchange and support the respiratory system, whereas a heart cell is there to beat for the heart, again, to pump the blood, and again, specialize in that way, whereas the stomach or the intestines are there to help digest food and then help absorb. And so again, different functions for different cell types, and again, that's how this all works out. Now again, we can organize our cells into different things. The first one being is cells are groups of cells that have a similar appearance and common function. We call those tissues, and we'll look at the different types of tissues here in a second. Those tissues can come together to form organs, which have different tissues organized into functional units. And then the organ systems are basically groups of organs that work together and do one main purpose or one main goal. And so again, we're going to look at this real quickly, but we're going to spend a lot more time later on looking at all these different systems. And so again, we can talk about the different organ systems, including digestive, circulatory, respiratory, and that. And again, you guys can look at all these things if you want and pause it and take a look at these things. But I'm not going to go through all these things. But again, you can see the organs, the main components, and then the tissues that make up these things. And we'll talk more about this as we go through these different systems as we go on. Today, we're going to primarily focus in on the endocrine system. And again, there's lots of different types of endocrine glands, and that we'll talk about that, what an endocrine gland is and all that and what it does, but really they're there to help maintain homeostasis in the body, and so that's what we're going to look at today. Other ones, again, looking at these things, looking at the different structures, and I think this is the same slide. That's kind of funny that they show the same slide again, so I'm not sure why this is much different. Maybe it's the functions, not the organs in this case. So again, just showing you the functions of these things, so the anatomy and physiology part, I get it. So there you go. All right, so let's take a look at the tissues themselves. And so again, we talk about these organized complex organ systems of animals. And again, we divide these into four main types of tissues. And so if you've had A&P before, you've probably studied this, but if you haven't had it, no problem. We're going to go through that today. And again, we break these down into four main tissue types. We have epithelial tissue, which is basically tissue that covers and lines things. We have connective tissue, which basically connects the organs and connects the body systems together. We have the muscle tissue that helps move, also helps support vessels, and then also the heart, the cardiac muscle. And then finally, we have the nervous tissue, which really is the kind of the electrified grid that controls a lot of these different things. And so we're going to spend a lot of time later on the semester talking about the nervous system and looking at how this all functions. But today we're just going to introduce the cells to you. Now again, this kind of just gives you a broad picture of looking just at an animal and the different tissues that are made up of these things. And again, I'm going to show you some of these different tissues here in just a second. But again, you can talk about epithelial tissue, which again, typically lines or covers things. We'll talk about muscle tissue that's important for locomotion and other things like that. Then you have the connective tissue, which again looks at a lot of things connecting the organs together, or if we talk about the liquid connective tissue in blood. And then the nervous tissue obviously is the signaling tissue that allows for these things to respond. You get inputs and other things, external inputs, and then you basically respond to those and then come back and then maybe send out a sensory input or a motor input so that you then move or do whatever to respond to that environmental signal. Again, nervous tissue, again, we're going to spend a lot more time in this in chapter 36 and 37 and 38. And so again, looking at the structure of the neuron, essentially you have the cell body, you have the dendrites that are coming off, and then you have the long tail, which is typically called or referred to as the axon. And so again, we'll look at that and look at these things as we go on a little later. But this is kind of a cool picture, so I just wanted to show you guys kind of a mix of neurons and blood and some of these other tissues, and it looks like even maybe muscle fibers and that in there, so kind of give you an idea. Now, epithelial tissue, like I said, is really those that cover and lines the organs, and it's divided by, again, the number of layers you have and the shape of the cells. And so typically, if you're one layer, you're called simple. And so if you have one layer of cells, you're called simple. And then you're described by the shape of the cell. So you have the squamous, which is kind of the flat, fried egg kind of appearance. You have the cuboidal, which is more of the cube shaped. And then you have the columnar, which looks like a column. Now, if you have more than one layer, you're typically called stratified. And so if you have two or more layers, you're called stratify. And again, you can have all three of these types as stratified layers. So you have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, and stratified columnar. And this just shows you some, again, microscopic pictures of looking at these. Columnar is typically found in the intestinal wall, and so that's where you're going to find the columnar. You also find it in the respiratory system. You find the pseudo-stratified columnar cells, so they have the little cilia and that on there, or you see it in the intestines with the villi and that as well. Cuboidal you typically find in the tubules of the kidney, so that's where you're going to see those quite a bit. And then the squamous cells are pretty much any of the surface cells that you see. So a lot of times we do scrapings of the cheek and that stuff in the inside and take a look at that, and those are simple squamous. The skin is squamous cells, and essentially they just kind of line up and protect over the top of these organs, and so that's what you see with the epithelial. Now, muscle, there's three types of muscle, and again, by looking at the types of muscle, you can see the difference between those. The skeletal muscle is always identified by the striations. So when you see striations in the muscle, that typically tells you that's skeletal muscle. And what makes this different than the other two is that it's voluntary, meaning that you have nervous control over it. And so you send nerve impulses to move your muscles. And so to move your arms and legs, you send nerve impulses from your brain, and that allows the muscles to contract and move. And so that's the skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is typically found in a lot of the areas that are the tubes, so the intestinal wall or the artery wall, you'll see the smooth muscle, and then you'll see it sometimes with glands and other things as well. This is primarily involuntary because, again, you don't really think about it. It's more under control of the brainstem. And so, again, you don't have to think about, when am I going to digest my food or squeeze and do the peristalsis of getting the food down into my stomach and that. So, again, that's more under involuntary control. And then likewise, the cardiac muscle, which separates out between these two. And so smooth, you don't see the striations, and it more is kind of in layers. And then the cardiac is kind of in between. You don't really see striations, but what you do see is these intercalculated discs that are kind of separated in these guys. And what that just represents is kind of these segmentations of the muscle cells and that. And again, we'll look more at this when we talk about the cardiac muscle and that. And again, it's involuntary. You don't have to think about beating your heart and say, okay, pump the blood, pump the blood, pump the blood. That's under control of the brainstem. And again, we'll look at that as we go along further on in the chapters and that stuff, but I just want to give you an idea. So again, three muscle types. Primarily, most of the muscle you see is the skeletal, but then, like I said, these guys tend to line the vessel walls and the digestive system, and then the cardiac muscle is going to be primarily the heart, and that's where you're going to see that. Now, the connective tissue, you have a wide range of different types of connective tissue, but the idea is that the connective tissue connects the tissues or connects the organs together. And so you can have loose connective tissue where, again, you have a lot of these single-stranded. This is like the collagen that you typically see, and it contains spaces in that. You'll see a mixture of different types of cells and fibers that go on in these cases. You have your bone tissue, again, typically with the bone you see these circles, concentric circles that go around, and that's typically what you see building around the style of bone. Cartilage tissue, you see that a lot of it is dense, and then what you have are these small areas that actually have the nuclei, and so you'll see these different cells with the nuclei interdispersed between the cartilage tissue, but again, most of it is pretty solid in that case. And then you have the dense connective tissue. This is the tendons and ligaments. And so the way you always remember this, and this is how I remember it, and maybe you got a better way of remembering these things, is that tendons connect muscle to bone. So when you think of tender meat, that's the muscle. So the muscle, again, is connected by the tendon, whereas the ligaments connect bone to bone. And so again, Those are the ones that primarily get damaged by athletes a lot of times because they twist their bones and that stuff, or they lose it in their knee and they tear an ACL or a MCL or something like that, and that's connecting the femur to or the femur to the tibia and fibula, and that's where you see those types of things. So that's how I always remember it. And then you can also tear tendons, because you hear a lot of times athletes tearing the tendon that connects like the pectoral muscle to the shoulder or something like that, or to the chest wall and that. And so it's a very painful, and again, a lot of times requires surgery and a lot of time off so that the body can heal. But that's typically what you think of the dense connective tissue. These are the things that connect these, either the muscles or the bones together. And then a lot of people don't realize this, but blood is also a tissue, and that is a liquid tissue that contains lots of blood cells. And so the primarily type blood cells that we think of is the red blood cells. And again, that's used for carrying oxygen to and from the cells. And then, well, I guess to the cells, and then CO2 away from the cells. And then you have the white blood cells, which are obviously responsible for the defense mechanisms. And we're going to look at that in chapter 35 with the immune system. And then you have these little things in there that are really not cells. They're kind of partial cells, I'd call them, and those are called platelets, and those help clot the blood. And again, we'll look at more of this as we get into immunology, and then also the cardiovascular system and look at that. But this is also, and again, it connects all the organs because it's an important tissue to regulate and move oxygen throughout the body, as well as the defense and the immune system. And when we look at that as well. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of the tissues. Now, these next couple of slides I'm just going to go through really quickly, but it just kind of shows you how animals and plants have developed systems to respond to the environment. And so again, the first one is environmental response. And so again, both the head of a sunflower and insect eyes both contain photoreceptors, so they can follow the sun and detect light. And so that's one of the things that you see both in plants and animals. Another one is nutritional mode. Again, the broad surface of many leaves allowing to do photosynthesis. Whereas again, for hunting prey and then they have stealth, speed, and sharp claws and teeth to help eat. And so again, consumers versus producers in those situations. Again, growth and regulation important in both. So again, hormones control growth patterns, flowering, and fruit development, whereas hormones control development events such as molting. You can see this lizard shedding its skin and growing, again, expanding out. And so again, hormones control that. You can look at transport, and again, we've talked about in plants to transport the phloem and xylem moving things through, whereas in animals you have the arteries and veins moving the circulatory fluid, which is primarily blood, through the vessels and that. And you also have the lymph system, which moves the lymph, and that's really the extracellular fluid. And so that's in third set of vessels that we have. Again, reproduction, seeds have stored food reserves that supply energy, whereas again, in mammals we produce milk, but also in the amniotes they have the eggs, which have the yolk sac and that provide minerals for the developing embryo as well. And so you see that not only in plants but in animals as well. Again, absorption, you think about the root hairs to absorb water and minerals for the plant, whereas in our digestive system, we have the little villi that allow us to absorb food and do a much better job absorbing food and water in our intestinal system. So that's another thing that you see. Gas exchange, again, the spongy mesophyll allows for gas exchange for the CO2 to come in and oxygen to go out, where in our respiratory system, we do the opposite. Oxygen comes in, CO2 comes out. And again, very, very similar, and again, in design, very, very interesting way of putting these things. I think this is kind of cool. That's why I kept this in here, because I think it's kind of cool to see the difference between plants and animals and how really close we really are. And some of the systems that we developed are very similar in the way that we do this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the endocrine system, and we're going to compare that to the nervous system for the first couple of slides. And again, both of them have the same type of job. They're both used for signaling. One does it through nerve impulses and electrical impulses running across this network of cells. The other one utilizes essentially hormones and chemical messages that get secreted into the blood and then have an effect on cell types throughout the body. And so that's really the big difference between the two. But really, you can kind of base them to the same type of function, in that they both are signaling and causing change within inside the organism. And again, it's the signal that they send and how they send that signal that's different. So like I said, the endocrine system signals released in the bloodstream by the endocrine cells, and they reach all locations, where the nervous system transmits signals along the dedicated routes. So again, the nerves, and in connecting to specific locations in the body. So that's one of the differences between these things. Again, this kind of has a highway system, where this one uses an already dedicated system in the blood to use for control on the body. Now, hormones and signaling. Again, the signaling molecules of the endocrine system are chemicals called hormones. They have effect either in a single location or throughout the body. But the biggest thing is they need the receptors. And so the receptors are going to play a huge role on whether or not the endocrine the signal is actually going to be seen. So you have to have signal, or you have to have receptors to understand the signal. Otherwise, it gets ignored. And so again, the endocrine system is adapted for coordinating gradual changes that affect the entire body. And so again, typically what you have is you have an endocrine cell that doesn't have a duct. What it does is releases hormone that eventually gets into the bloodstream, that travels throughout the body, and then it gets released throughout the body, and then it only responds to cells that actually have a receptor to it. And so that's what you see typically with the endocrine system. Now, with the nervous system, typically what you have is its own set of highway that essentially gets a stimulus, it sends a nerve impulse down to the different nervous cells, and then they act on a certain type of cell that it's connected to. And again, other neurons, muscle cells, endocrine and exocrine cells can all receive nerve impulses. And again, the nervous system communication involves more than one type of signal, not just a chemical signal, but we also see electrical signals, and again, the gradients in that stuff as we go along. And we're going to look at that again in chapter 37. And then the nervous system is well suited for directing immediate and rapid responses, as opposed to the endocrine, which is more of a gradual change and a gradual response over time. Whereas nervous is instantaneous. You want it to respond right away and do these changes. So again, the endocrine glands are again grouped of ductless organs. And so what makes endocrine, and essentially this is the difference between endocrine glands and exocrine glands, is endocrine are inside the body and they're ductless, meaning that they don't have any separate ducts that go outside the body. Essentially what they do is they're really close to blood sources or bloodstream, so that they can secrete their chemical signal, which is hormones, into the system. And so they send it into the circulatory system, and that disperses throughout the body and then gets released throughout. And then the cells they respond to are going to be ones that have the receptors for it. Exocrine, on the other hand, always have ducts, and they tend to go to the outside or into the body cavities. And so that's what you see with exocrine glands. And again, we're not looking at exocrine, we're only looking at endocrine today. But examples of exocrine glands would be like the sweat glands or the oil glands on our skin. And so they have a series of ducts that lead to the outside, and then they secrete oil or sweat depending on what we need. So sweat to cool us down, or oil glands to keep us somewhat moist and supple. So that's the other reason why. And again, that's the difference between endocrines, all internal. And so you see internal effects with that. And just to give you an example, here are some of the different endocrine glands that are throughout the body. And we're going to talk about some of these here in a few minutes, so I won't spend too much time, but you can kind of see some of the major ones. Again, you have the sex endocrine glands, which are the testes or ovaries. You have the adrenals, which are sitting on top of the kidneys. You have the pancreas, which is responsible for insulin. You have the thyroid, again, and the parathyroid, and then you have the pituitary, both the anterior and posterior. We're going to look at that as well and look at some of the things and talk about that. And you also have this pineal gland, which is responsible. It's kind of your third eye, which does the circadian rhythms. And so again, it's an important for sleeping and doing all those different things and responding to light. So again, regulation of endocrine signaling is that a stimuli can cause endocrine cells and glands to release hormones. Again, they're released in response to organic molecules. Nervous system signals are other hormones. And then the hypothalamus, the almost sized region of the brain, controls most of the neuroendocrine signaling in mammals. And so you can see that it's kind of down here. And then coming off of that is the pituitary gland, which is really the most responsible glands that we think of when we think of the endocrine glands in these situations. Now, most of these systems are based on the feedback loops in that, and so you'll see that again. Typically, what you see is either you get a positive feedback or a negative feedback, so you either turn something on or shut something down depending on whether the response is needed. And so The example that I have here is the negative feedback with calcium. And so again, typically in homeostasis, you have normal calcium in the blood. But if the calcium levels get too high, your thyroid will release this thing called calcitonin, and that will cause an increase of calcium into the bone, which causes, again, a decrease in the amount of calcium in the intestines, and then also a decrease in reabsorption in the kidneys, so you secrete out more calcium. Okay, calcium levels fall, and hopefully they read there. But if they fall too low, then your parathyroid will react and release this PTH, which will cause calcium to come off from the bones. It will cause you to have more uptake in the intestines and then more reabsorption in the kidneys. And so again, now they rise. And so it's a constant give and take based on what's happening in the blood levels. And so typically these endocrine systems are really kind of regulators, and they're just responding to what's going on in the environment. So they can be turned on and turned off, much like a thermostat in your house. So when it gets too cold, the heat comes on, and when it gets too hot, the air comes on. And so again, and you don't have to do anything. Your body recognizes it and does it for you. So you don't have to think about it and say, okay, I'm too hot, I need to sweat now. Or, oh, I'm too cold, I better start to shiver now. Your body does it automatically. And so that's one of the things you think about. Now, we do have some simple endocrine pathways, and that includes the digestive juices in the intestinal system. And so in our stomachs, again, the pH drops very low. And so in our stomachs, that pH is anywhere from 1 to 2.5. And again, depending on what's in there, you can see a fluctuation in the pH. However, once it leaves the stomach, that pH goes back up to 7. So if you see, here's the duodenum that's kind of hiding behind the large intestine here. This is actually at a pH of 6 to 7, and so it's more of a neutral pH. So how does it go from 1 or 2 to 7? And so really what coordinates that is your intestinal system in the simple endocrine system that you have right there, and I'll show you this in just a second. So you actually have this little system set up so that you can increase the pH. So what happens is you have these little endocrine cells that are sitting in your intestinal, in your duodenum, and they secrete this thing called secretin. So very interesting. It's called secretin. It's probably because it's one of the first hormones that we realized, and so it got the simple name of secretin, where they get these things, and that gets into circulation in the blood. And what that causes is the target cells in the pancreas to rise the pH. And so essentially this is the signaling. So the pH is too low in the duodenum. You just got a bolus of food in there, and so now it has to raise the pH. So those S cells of the duodenum say, oh, pH is low. Let's release the secretin. It hits the pancreatic cells. They cause a bicarbonate release from the pancreas into the intestines and raise that up. And so that's one of the important mechanisms that we have in our blood to maintain blood pH, as well as the bicarbonate buffers and it's an important system to regulate blood. And we'll talk more about that when we get into circulation and that, and how we keep our blood at a normal neutral pH. But this is kind of cool, just showing you a simple system in the intestines that recognizes, hey, pH is too low. We just got this big bolus of food. Our pH is too low from the stomach. Let's raise up the pH. And again, just a simple secretin protein, which is released, and then it triggers the target cells in the pancreas to add bicarbonate to raise the pH in the intestine. And so now the enzymes in the intestine work very well. Okay, so for many of the hormones, though, you need the neuroendocrine signaling. And again, this is when the nervous system detects a process and processes a stimulus. And so again, this could be as simple as being too cold or too warm, or maybe eating some food or something else in the body. And so now the brain sends a signal and says, okay, we've got something, let's do it. And so in vertebrates, that happens. Again, the pituitary gland is really, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are going to be responsible for again, that environmental change. And so again, the hypothalamus is here, and you can see the pituitary gland is broken down into two different glands. You have the posterior lobe and the anterior lobe, and we're going to explain what both of them do in here in just a second. Now, again, the posterior lobe is an extension of the hypothalamus, so you can kind of see it comes down off the end of the hypothalamus here, and then that posterior lobe, because it's behind the anterior lobe, and again, it secretes hormones that are synthesized by the hypothalamus. And so hypothalamus makes these things, and then it transfers it to the posterior lobe where it gets secreted. The anterior synthesizes and secretes its own hormones. And so it's just kind of an attachment to the hypothalamus, but its own separate entity, whereas the posterior really takes all its role from the pituitary gland. It's not pituitary, but the hypothalamus itself. And so again, we know hypothalamus really controls a lot of times our temperature and that. And so a lot of the posterior lobe is responsible for temperature regulation, where the anterior lobe is going to be necessary for other things that you see in the body. And we'll talk about some of these functions here in just a second. Now, one of the things that posterior pituitary pathways do is the regulation of milk release during nursing. And so, again, the suckling of the nipples stimulates the neurons to generate nerve impulses to the hypothalamus. And so, again, you get the suckling. And so, what it does is it sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which stimulates the posterior pituitary to release this oxytocin, and the oxytocin goes throughout the blood. It binds to the target cells in the mammary glands, and so that releases milk. And so again, you have this going on, and it stimulates further release of milk, and this continues on as a positive feedback until the baby stops suckling, and then the milk production stops. And so again, typically what you'll see is pregnancy will bring about this change in that the breast tissue will become more responsive to, again, the suckling feature in that, and then you'll see the production of milk go up, especially during pregnancy, and then after pregnancy, after delivery for milk production. And then over time, it gradually stops, especially as the baby is weaned off breastfeeding. And so you'll see the decrease in the production of milk over time because, again, of the response. And so that's one of the things that the posterior pituitary pathway does is, again, the regulation of lactation in mammals. Now, another posterior pituitary hormone is the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. We're actually going to talk more about this in the kidneys, and so again, you'll see this come up again. But this is an important hormone, whether or not to hang on to water or release water, and so that's going to be the idea. And so again, typically it looks at the blood levels of how much water is in the system. And so ADH, when the water is low, it will signal to the kidneys to absorb more water. And if the water levels are high in the blood, it will say, okay, stop absorbing the water, let's secrete it out. And so that's typically what you see. Now, other hormones that you'll see again in the posterior again include the oxytocin, which is the mammary glands, and then the smooth muscle in the uterus. And then the anterior, which we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a minute, includes things like the gonadotrophic hormones like testosterone or estrogen, growth hormone in the bones and tissues. Again, that's one of the things that you see a lot of times, and again can be abused by making synthetic or artificial growth hormone and that stuff. Prolactin, which also stimulates the mammary glands, and then some other ones like this ACTH, the androcorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal cortex on the kidneys. And then again, the other part is going to be the thyroid stimulating hormone on the thyroid. And so again, we're going to see all these different things as we go along throughout the semester, the rest of the semester and that stuff. But we're going to talk a little bit about the TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, here in a second, and then also talk a little bit about the adrenal glands here in a second as well. So some other anterior pituitary pathways include, again, a diverse set of hormones, and again has lots of functions throughout. And again, one of them that we have over here is these again tropic hormones that have these cascades that affect multiple parts of the body. And so that's why they're called tropic, because they have lots of different effects. And so again, the anterior pituitary is really separate from the hypothalamus, and so they make and secrete their own hormones. And so again, what happens is that one of the things is the thyroid hormone levels drop. That's the stimulus, and so it starts to produce this TRH, which again causes it to secrete. This causes the anterior pituitary to release TSH. That TSH goes to the thyroid gland, where it stimulates the cells of the thyroid to secrete T3 and T4. That goes throughout the body, and so you see two different hormones being released at this case. Increases the blood and body tissues levels increase in the target cells throughout the body. And then again, you see the thyroid hormones blocks further TSH release as a negative feedback. And so you have negative feedback that shuts down the system and positive feedback that turns on the system. And so that's just one of the things just to show you. Again, I'm not going to expect you to know this on a test or anything, but this just gives you an example of what the anterior pituitary does. And again, a lot of these are multiple hormones that it does, and that's why it's called these tropic hormones, because it has a lot of cascades to these things. Now, interesting enough, we have two types of hormones. And so now we're going to get into specific hormones and kind of look at this. There's two types. There's the water soluble hormone, which essentially just sits in the capillary and gets released off. And typically, what happens is it gets secreted out of the blood capillary, and then it will bind to receptor. Now, one of the problems with a water soluble hormone is that it cannot get through the cell membrane because that's a lipid. And so it has to bind to receptor on the cell, then it goes in and it has a cascade effect inside using enzymes and other things going on inside the target cell. And so that's one of the big differences between that and a lipid soluble hormone, which we'll see in a minute. So water soluble hormones leave the blood vessel. Again, they're typically by themselves in the blood vessel. It's going to be another difference you see. And then they bind to receptor on the cell. Now, lipid soluble hormones, which are things like estrogen and testosterone, and that are ones that actually are carried along by a transport protein in the blood vessel. Sometimes it can be free. They leave and diffuse, and then they can diffuse right into the cell. So they don't really need a cell receptor to bind to because they're lipid soluble, so they can go right through the membrane itself. And then the receptors for this are actually in the nucleus, and then they stimulate DNA and production by mRNA, and again, transcription translation. And so with the water soluble, typically you see protein cascades and enzyme cascades going through and activating through enzyme catalyzing reactions and that stuff. Whereas with the lipid soluble, you're seeing more on a genetic level. And so that's the difference between those. So water soluble, more on a cascade effect of enzymes inside the cell, not really playing with the DNA. It's already using the proteins that are available to it. And again, the receptor on top, where these guys go directly to the nucleus and then stimulate transcription translation of certain DNA components that are necessary. And so again, you see transcription of particular genes. And so again, making new proteins after the activity. So I guess the rule of thumb is water soluble, use enzymes that are already present and again have to bind to receptor, where lipid soluble go right into the cell, go into the DNA and stimulate transcription translation to make new proteins and new enzymes to drive the cell function. Okay, and so that's the idea with these types of things. Now, again, hormones can have multiple effects, and so some of these guys can actually have multiple effects depending on the type of receptor we're talking about. So one of these guys is epinephrine, and so epinephrine you probably have heard of, where it's kind of given if you have an allergic reaction. And so if you stop breathing and that stuff, you've seen the shows and that stuff where they take this big giant needle and jab it into someone's heart to get their heart starting. Or if you think of like an EpiPen and you inject it into the leg or into the arm or something. So if someone's having a severe allergic reaction, they can start to breathe again. And again, it's not something where they can just then be fine. They need to go to the hospital. But what it does is it does multiple things. And again, it's not just one receptor that it reacts with, but multiple receptors. And so here you can see one of the things that epinephrine will do is that, and it's released by the adrenal glands, and those are on top of the kidneys, is that when it's secreted and it gets a response, and so a lot of times this is with the fight or flight response, and so when you get scared or something like that, you release this epinephrine, and what it does in your body is a couple of different things. The first thing that it does is it causes glucose to be released from the cells, and so essentially what it does is it binds to this beta receptor on the liver cell, and that causes glycogen to release glucose, and so it increases the glucose level in cells so your muscles can respond right away. And so that's number one. The second thing that it can do, which is a different receptor, is that epinephrine, well, in case this is another beta receptor, but it's on a different cell. And on this cell, what it does is the smooth muscle cell where it causes it to relax. And so this causes vasodilation. Remember, smooth muscles typically around vessels and the digestive system. And so again, it causes these cells to relax, which causes vasodilation to occur, increasing blood flow to the muscles. And so again, to respond fast. So you increase the glucose and cause the muscles to respond. The last thing that this does is that it also binds to the alpha receptors in this, and then what it does is it causes, again, the smooth muscle, so it's a different receptor on the intestines, which causes them to constrict. Now, when it constricts, it causes a lower level of blood to go to the intestines because we want more blood to stop digesting food, but going to the muscles so that they can respond. And so you can see that epinephrine, depending on what cell it's reacting with, can have multiple roles inside the body. And so that's just giving you an example that hormones just don't always have one job in life. They can have multiple jobs responding to different cells, causing different things to occur. Okay, and one of those examples is epinephrine. Now, evolution of hormone function, again, there's a lot of evidence where different animals use the same hormones but for different things. And again, for thyroid hormone, it plays a role in metabolism across many lineages of animals. But we also see it have a unique function in frogs is that when they release thyroid hormone, it actually causes the loss of the tail and becoming an adult. And so part of the metamorphic response in amphibians is to lose the tail and become an adult. And so that's what we see in this situation, when we release the thyroid hormone, it now causes the tail to be released, and now you go from a tadpole to an adult frog. We also see prolactin has a broad range of activities in other invertebrates as well, and you can look that up in that. But typically in mammals, it has to do with secretion of milk in the breast tissue, and again, that's another one that we see. Now, feedback control maintains the internal environment in many mammals, or animals, I should say. And again, we're going to look at this more here in a few minutes, looking at the feedback control. But the difference between regulating and conforming is, again, what does it do with its external environment? So in warm-blooded animals or endotherms, they can control their body temperature no matter what the external temperature is. And so again, that is a regulator. A conformer is one that responds to its external environment. And so if it's cold, they're going to be cold. If it's warm, they get warm. And so they don't change at all during those things. And again, you see that between the difference between mammals and fish, amphibians, and most reptiles. And so that's going to be the difference that you see in there is that they have to they respond to their environmental signals, and again, too hot or too cold, where mammals and birds all can regulate their temperature with endothermy and again metabolism in that way. And so they're called regulators. Okay, and so a regulator is one that uses internal mechanisms to control the internal environment despite external fluctuation. And so again, the temperature stays the same, whereas a conformer is going to be one that responds to the external environment and changes their temperature based on the external temperature. Okay, and so that would be the idea. They conform to whatever the temperature is, whereas a regulator is going to be the same temperature no matter what the external environment is. And so again, endothermy versus ectothermy, and we're going to look at this more here in a minute. Now, some internal conditions can be regulated, and again, there may be animals that can control internal conditions and not others. Again, one of the examples are fish can conform to the surrounding temperature, but they regulate the solute concentrations in their interstitial fluid and surrounding body tissues so they don't freeze. And so that's one of the reasons why fish can still be active in the water, even though the water is frozen up above them and that, and again, they don't freeze during that time. Now, another interesting one, and I showed this one here, which I thought this is kind of cool too, is you see that typically animals can regulate their body temperature, and they typically do that, and they maintain their body temperature all the way through, and don't change when the air temperature changes. However, when they hibernate, they actually allow their body temperature to drop, and so again, they get closer to the air temperature, and so again, I guess you could call this a form of regulation, or it's a way to basically slow down the body. So they lose the ability to regulate, and now they become more like a conformer during hibernation. And then as soon as they wake up again, then they go back to being a regulator again and regulating their body temperature. And so that's an interesting example that you see in hibernating mammals, is that they can conform, and then regulate, and then hibernation hits, they conform, and then they conform to the external environment, and then they go back up again once they wake up. And so you see that as well. Now, homeostasis essentially is just the word to maintain a steady state in the organism. And again, it doesn't matter regardless of the external environment, but you're trying to keep an internal environment the same. Again, in humans, we control our body temperature, blood pH, and glucose concentration at a constant level. We want to keep those things the same, and if something does change, we can affect it. And so again, that's an important mechanism that we have. And again, the regulation is very similar to what we think of as the thermostat. And so we set the room temperature at 20 degrees C. If the temperature increases, the thermostat turns the heater off, and then the room temperature decreases. If it gets too warm or the temperature decreases, we turn the heater on, and that temperature then rises. And so that's kind of the idea. So again, heating versus cooling and doing those different things. And it's very simple to think about. Okay, and again, in animals, we see this as well. The homeostasis is by maintaining a variable at a set point. And so again, we have stimuli and a sensor, and by a sensor and trigger response. And again, the hypothalamus controls our body temperature, and again, it can control whether we sweat or we shiver. And so again, based on the body temperature. And so if we get too warm, we start to release hormones that allow us to go and sweat and cool down. And then the other part of it is then we have the negative feedback, where again, if we get too cold, we get vasoconstriction, and then we start to shiver to move our muscles to generate heat, and again, to warm ourselves up. And so again, it's a variable. Response returns a variable to the set point and always tries to go back to the main temperature. Okay, now again, it relies largely on negative feedback, a control mechanism that reduces the stimulus, and again, homeostasis moderates but does not eliminate changes in the internal environment. And so again, it tries to maintain it, but obviously any external factors can have an effect. And then again, we try to maintain that, and again, keeping those set points. And so that's always a thing. But if certain regular changes in the environment are essential, again, we have to look at this. And so we'll look at this as well. But one of the things that we do see is fever and that stuff, and we'll talk about that here in a second, where the set point can change. And so that's one of the things, especially if we're fighting off a disease, our bodies will actually warm up to try and eliminate that disease by warming our blood, and again, affecting the bacteria that are in the blood. Now, one of the ways that animals can regulate is by thermal regulation, and again, maintain internal body temperature within normal range. And so if we look at this, typically like marine animals and that, they have a layer of blubber on them that contains the insulation on the inside. So the body temperature stays around 37 degrees, and you can see the blood flow going in. But the flippers don't have that, and so there's no blubber in the flippers, and so what you see is that it can maintain its blood. And so the way that this works is that it has kind of this countercurrent system, and during this countercurrent system, the heat escapes from the warm part of the blood and then warms up the veins to return to the body, so that the body temperature goes back up. And so you'll see that the temperature reduces. These guys flow, the heat flows from the warm end to the cool end and warms the blood back up. So the dolphin's not sitting there spending its time trying to warm the blood back up, because basically it's using its own body temperature in the flippers to do that for him. And so that's one of the nice things, is that you're not trying to warm up the blood at 18 degrees on this side, and it's all due to the countercurrent system of the arteries and veins that it has in the system. And so that's what we're seeing here. Now, we mentioned this before. Endothermic animals generate heat by metabolism, and so birds and mammals are endotherms. And again, the endotherm is going to be maintaining internal body temperature no matter what the system. And again, the ectothermic animals are going to be, again, more of a conformer, because they're going to respond to the external sources. And so again, most include invertebrates, fishes, amphibians, and non-avian reptiles. And so again, they respond to the external environment, where mammals and birds really have their own temperature, and again, are using metabolism to do that. Now, endotherms maintain a stable body temperature in face of large fluctuations, and again, ectotherms can regulate by behavioral means. And so typically what you see is that an endotherm, no matter what the temperature is, will stay the same body temperature, but an ectotherm has to either move into the sun and warm up, or move away and hide to cool off. And so again, that's going to be one of those things. And so they have to respond to their environment. And so if the environment is warm, they're going to go out and warm themselves up. And so that's why when you have a pet lizard or something, you need a warm lamp so they can warm up. Then they need a cool spot somewhere to hide to cool off as well. Whereas a mammal, if you have a dog or cat, you don't need to have a separate little warm light for them, because they can maintain their own temperature through eating and doing all these different things. And so again, that's the difference between an endotherm and an ectotherm. Now again, balancing the heat loss and gain. These exchange heat by 4 physical processes, including radiation, evaporation, convection, and conduction. You can kind of see this. Radiation is sitting out in the sun and getting the heat from there. Evaporation is, again, losing water and heat through the air. Conduction is basically taking the heat from that warm rock, and then convection is also feeling the heat or cool from the wind in that. And so again, heat is always transferred from an object of higher temperature to one of lower temperature to warm it up. And you know this, if you grab something warm, you feel the heat and you feel it warm up your hand and that stuff. And so that's why we warm up with these heat packs and all these other things on these really cold days, because it gives us warmth and warms up our hands. And so ectotherms really utilize this, because again, then they can warm themselves up. The same is true if they want to cool off. So what they do is they find a cool place where they can give off the heat that they've built up, and if they want to cool off, they go to places where they're cool and they cool down. And we do this too. You know this. When you get into a cold bed at night, okay, it's really cold, but eventually it warms up because the body heat that we give off warms up the covers and the pillows and the sheets that we have, because that warm heat transfers from us to our surroundings. And so again, we warm up the clothes that we have, and also the bedding that we have in those things. Now, again, circulatory adaptations for thermal regulation. Again, the response to changes in environmental temperature, we can alter our blood flow on the core and the surface. And so one way we can do that is through vasodilation. And so this is widening the vessels. And what that allows us to do is allow us to remove heat. And so that's one way to do it. And so when you're warm, you get flush. And the reason for that is you get vasodilation, and that gets off heat. And that also triggers the sweat response and other things that we see. Vasoconstriction is the opposite. And so what it does is it closes off the blood vessels and maintains the blood primarily in the major vessels. And so it reduces heat loss in that, and then it also triggers the muscles to start shaking, which is the shivering part. And so that's the vasoconstriction part of it. So our blood vessels dilate and constrict depending on how warm or cold we are. And so that's another important mechanism to maintain temperature. Okay, and then this is that countercurrent exchange that I was explaining about with the dolphin and that. And again, many marine mammals and birds have this. And so again, another place you see that, again, maintains the warmth due to the insulation and the feathers. In the legs, though, you have these arteries and veins that, again, exchange heat. And so the artery will be warm, and it will exchange the heat with the vein that's returning back up. And so you can see that the organism, the animal, does not have to spend time trying to rewarm their blood, because the system does it for them. And so, again, in their legs, the blood gets cooler as it goes down, and it warms up as it's returning back into the main part of the body. And again, that allows for the changing of temperature through the fluids, and again, the opposite directions helps reduce. And so things that are warmer will transfer heat over to things that are colder. And so again, kind of uses that, and that's kind of the same way that a radiator works as well. And so again, radiator pumps warm water through, and it passes the heat on to the cooler parts. And so that's what you see there. Now again, acclimation can be, and again, birds and mammals vary their insulation to acclimatize to seasonal temperature changes. So again, animals get heavier during the winter in response to that, and so you put on insulation. Again, you get a little heavier during the winter because you need to maintain the heat. When it gets summer, you lose the weight. And so that's what you'd hope in that. And so that's the idea that would happen. And again, ectotherms also can do things on a cellular level, and some can actually even produce these antifreeze compounds or antifreeze proteins that allow them to maintain a certain level so they don't freeze with the water when this freezes as well. And this shows you kind of these antifreeze molecules in between that keep the cells from freezing up and the cytoplasm from freezing up in these fish that are under the water in these cases. And you can see actually ice crystals forming in the water, but the fish doesn't freeze because he has these compounds that allow them to survive and not freeze their cells. And so again, prevents ice formation in their cells. So pretty cool mechanisms for adaptation in these cases. Again, the thermostat's physiological thermal regulations controlled by the hypothalamus, and again, acts as the thermostat. It triggers for heat loss and heat generating mechanisms. And again, we've talked about this before, feedback loops and that stuff. When you get warm, your vessels dilate, you get the response from the sweat. This is an exocrine gland that causes sweat to release and cool you down. Body temperature then decreases. If you get cold, again, your thermostat regulates, it constricts the blood, it causes the muscles to shiver, and then you warm up. And so again, you get more blood flow to warm you up and then shiver. And so again, your body's trying to maintain that internal temperature between 36 and 38 degrees Celsius. And so again, tries to do that good job. But eventually, if you get too cold or put too cold environment, you could freeze. Or if you're put in too hot, you could also have problems. And again, we see this all the time. You see poor animals or kids left in warm cars, and then they suffer heat stroke or heat exhaustion and potentially die in the car because, again, they get too warm. And again, sometimes you can't do anything about that. Well, you could by taking them out, but thing in those environments where it gets that way. And then likewise, if you fall into water that's very cold or something like that, and your body can't maintain the body temperature, you go into basically hypothermia, where your body temperature drops too much, and then essentially you go into a coma, and you could die from that as well due to that. So you get too high of a temperature, too cold, and again, too much environmental pressure can affect that as well. Okay, so we made it to the end today. So hopefully you got something out of this. Again, we talked about tissues at the beginning. We talked about the endocrine glands and how they regulate a lot of the systems in the body. And then finally, we looked at feedback control and how that regulates the system as well, especially in temperature and that. Okay, so again, the animal form and function are correlated at all levels of organization. We talked about the 4 types of tissues. The tissues make organs and the organ systems. And like I said, the next few chapters in this semester, we're going to spend all our time looking at these different organ systems and how they work. But just be aware of the 4 types of tissues. Again, the epithelial are the ones that cover and surround the organs. The nervous tissue is the signaling tissue. The muscles are the ones that obviously get the signals from the nervous tissue and respond. And then the connective tissue connects the organs together. The endocrine and nervous systems act individually, and again, the differences between them, we talked about that in the signaling pathways. But the endocrine system, very important. Endocrine's internal, again, uses the blood vessels, circulatory system to send its signals out. Chemical messages, either water soluble or lipid soluble, and the effects that they have on the cells, and how those things go. And so again, you can see some have single effects, others have multiple effects on a lot of different things. And then finally, we talked about feedback control, again, maintaining the internal environment, homeostasis, making sure that the body stays the right thing. In humans, like I said, we talk about temperature a lot. We talk about blood glucose and the blood pH, and those are things that are maintained, again, by different parts of their body. Hypothalamus controls the temperature and, again, has these different responses, and it works very similar to what we think of as a thermostat in our house. Okay, with that, we made it to the end of this chapter. The lecture looks at the kidneys, specifically in osmoregulation, which is another important homeostasis feature. I separated it out so this video wouldn't be so long, and so hopefully it isn't too much of a stretch in that stuff, but kind of give you guys a break in that stuff. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and otherwise, I'll talk to you next time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again.